Hey guys, welcome to the Discipline Life podcast, the place where we talk about power differential relationships and domestic discipline. My name is Arya, and this is my husband, Coda.
Hello. And in today's episode, we're going to be talking about giving consent. Not a controversial topic at all.
No, not at all.
And now, you've received quite a bit over the years of you doing your Instagram and things on the topic of consent, right?
I've read quite a bit about consent, yes.
And, well, not only that you've read about it, but have you had people give you a lot of questions about this?
I have over time. There's been a few questions about consent and the, place that consent holds within domestic discipline.
Yeah, and that's what I was thinking, which is why, we had talked about tackling this topic in this episode, because you get that asked so much, and you've given me articles and different things to read and to look at about the issue of consent. Not that we've ever had a problem in that area, or you're worried about that, but you just want me to again, like, be informed and some things and kind of know what's going on out there.
Right, because I think that a lot of times I've seen the topic of consent, specifically in the domestic discipline realm, can get a little fuzzy sometimes. And I think that we just wanted to tackle this topic just to bring some clarity where we stand on that.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Yeah, and talk about it in our relationship, because I think sometimes in a relationship like this, people assume that maybe there is no consent happening, that this is somebody's making the rules, there's a dictator, there's a doormat, and that's how this works.
And there are opinions out there that would support that assumption.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess where we should begin is telling everyone in our relationship that there has never been a time where there has not been consent.
Absolutely.
And there has never been a time where we don't. It's not like this topic for us gets buried for a long period of time. We always check in with one another. We are always asking. I am specifically always asking you how you're feeling about
right, and
things.
I do ask you as well, because consent goes both ways.
Agreed. Yeah. In fact, you've asked me many times, and the only reason I'm laughing for those who are listening out there is there's been times when you've asked me if I'm still okay with doing domestic discipline.
Right,
if we wanted to continue.
Because if you caught our episode last week, you would know that I was the one that brought domestic discipline up in our relationship. And so I want to make sure that it is something that you are still actively participating in of your own free will.
Right. But when you first brought, because I don't know if we've mentioned this yet, but if we have already mentioned this on the podcast, I'm going to mention it again. You were the one that actually brought domestic discipline to me.
Right, we talked about that last week.
Yeah, and so so from the very, very beginning, especially since you brought it to me, there has been consent. I have asked you, are you okay with what we're doing? Now, I want people to say too, this doesn't mean that this is still a dynamic where I'm not in charge. I just want to put that.
Oh, for sure. Like, there's definitely a hierarchy in our relationship, and there's definitely authority and submission, and those things are in their place within our relationship. But there are times where I can somewhat step out of that role and say, okay, time out. We need to talk before we go any further.
Right. Yeah.
Now, before we get too far into this subject, should we, for the sake of the listener here, should we just define what consent is?
Yeah, I think that's something we definitely need to do. So I'm going to use my own definition here, and then you can tell me if it matches the correct Webster definition here. I To make it very, very simple, I think it just comes down to the fact that you make sure, just like our relationship, my spouse is 100% okay with the rules and with the dynamics that we have set in the relationship. Do you think that's a fair definition?
That's a fair definition. I would personally take it one step further, and I believe that consent is not only making sure that everyone agrees, but I believe that you should take it one step further and have informed consent. So that means that you talk about all of the different aspects of what's going to happen, and you lay out everything, and only then can the person give their consent when they understand what is expected and what the parameters are and all of the things that go with that.
That was a better definition.
And so I think that really consent is understanding the particulars of any situation. In this aspect, we're talking about domestic discipline, but this can be for any situation, understanding the all the nuances, and then being able to say, yes, I agree, or no, I don't. And in order for consent to be there has to be that opt out. There has to be the ability to say no.
Oh, yeah, I would agree with that.
Because without the ability to say no, then it's coercion. It's not consent.
Right.
Now, the dictionary definition, if you're interested, is permission for something to happen or agreement to do something.
Okay.
That's the actual dictionary definition. So I think we're close.
Okay.
On our personal interpretations of that.
Give myself a little bit of a pat on the back. I'm not. She will. The reason I'm saying that is she will tell you I'm not very good with defining things sometimes, or even expressing. So it cannot be pretty sometimes. And so knowing that that's the definition, we sat down at the very, very beginning of all of this after you brought this to me, and I had time to mold this over a little bit, and we now it's evolved, but when we first started it, we had the set of rules and the things that we were going to do, and we agreed upon those.
We did. And even beyond that, we had the discussion of, is this a relationship dynamic that we both consent to? Once we agreed mutually that this was, then we had a discussion about what are the parameters of that?
Yes, right.
Because even as the submissive wife in the situation, I was allowed to voice all of my concerns, and I was allowed to set boundaries around what I would and would not accept within our relationship.
Yes, that's true too. And I want to kind of be there for just a moment, because I think that it's important for the audience listening to let them know that, because that you were able to establish some boundaries, that was okay with me, and we established those things. Because this, again, going back to it, is not, okay, my wife has brought to me domestic discipline, so now I get to make all the rules, and she has to be okay with all of them, and if she doesn't like that, then she gets punished, and it just becomes a thing where you have no say at all.
And you get to decide and dictate what those punishments are.
Exactly.
And that's not the case, because, for instance, one limit that I have within our relationship that is quite common in many relationships is using mouth soaping. And I don't know if you've ever heard
I
of
was
that.
going to say that's a thing. I actually didn't
It
know
is.
that.
It is where, if a wife has a tendency to talk back, her husband may, for a punishment, put soap in her mouth. And that's something that I do not agree to. That is not something that I consent to being used on me. I don't think it's wrong for other people to consent to that in their relationship
If they want to, right?
Yeah, if that's something that works for them. But that's not something I consent to, and so that's not on the list of available punishments in our relationship.
Yeah. The only reason I was speechless there for a minute is I was like, man, I can't believe maybe there's some couples out there that are okay with that. But hey, I'm not in that relationship, and that's fine for them, I guess.
We don't get to decide what's okay for another couple.
No,
Only
sure.
they can do that. But we're here just to say it's okay to have limits around what's okay to you, even as the submissive wife in the situation.
Sure. Sure.
I think one of the limits that you had early on was there were certain implements that you are not comfortable using.
Yes, that was very true because since this was the first time that we had done this, I did not want to use certain things that I had not used before because I was afraid of hurting you, and so I didn't want to do that. But then as time has progressed and I've gotten a little bit more comfortable with those things, then yeah, it's changed a little bit.
Yeah, there's been some changes there. I mean, we've never used a cane, for instance.
Nope.
But I
never
think
used one of those.
that you would be willing to try that if we needed to.
Mm-hmm.
But that was one of the things that you had a limit around in the very beginning.
I did, yeah.
But there's still, I think, implements that you and I both would have limits around, even now.
Yes. I don't see that changing, but it could. But yes, I should mention that as we have gone through this, there are implements that we thought would be okay that we tried, that we eventually.
Well, and that wasn't necessarily placing limits around those. It was more of we tried them and they weren't effective.
Right.
And
right.
so we stopped using them just because they weren't working for us.
Right.
And I think that the topic of consent is more important when it comes to the submissive wife. Not because a husband's consent doesn't matter, but because he is in the place of authority and he is in the place of rule making, he doesn't have to necessarily have that discussion with his wife the way a wife has to have the discussion with her husband.
Yeah, I can agree with that because of a dynamic difference there.
Yeah, because if you had a limit around using a cane, you were just completely against it, you didn't want to do it, you would never have to tell me that. You're just never going to choose to have that implement in our home.
Yeah, I think the only time I would tell you that is the times where you've asked maybe about that.
Right.
And then I've just said, no, I don't feel comfortable using it or I don't want to.
Right. And that's the only time it would ever come up. But, if a husband has a limit around punishments or rules, he doesn't necessarily have to tell his wife. He just doesn't set those rules or he doesn't use those punishments. Yeah. And unless she asks about it, he never has to bring it up to her. Where if a wife has a limit around a rule, say, hey, you've asked me to do this thing, but I'm really not comfortable with that, or I've tried it and it's really just not setting right with me, she has to bring that to her husband. She has to have that conversation.
Yes. Yeah. And you had that conversation with me.
I did.
On some of those. I'm sorry, I'm blanking right now though on one in particular.
I can't remember exactly. Well, for instance, we were very ambitious with our New Year's goals this year. And I was like, I want to read more. Well, at the very same time, I took on doing this podcast, doing the podcast with Caleb over at Traditional Domestic Discipline, and I started blogging more.
Yes.
And so I'm not reading as much as I would like. And so I had to come to you and be like, hey, can we take the punishment aspect of this goal away? Because I don't necessarily feel like it's fair to be punished for not reading when I spent 2 hours writing that
Right.
day or
Right.
creating content in some way. And I said, I'll still leave it on my list just so that I can be reminded that that's a goal that I have, but it's not something that I aim to do daily anymore.
I unfortunately am not reading as much as I'd like to either. So, but no, I understand what you're saying with the goals that we've set this year and how we wanted it enforced. And yeah, that was definitely an area where you just came to me and said, "Hey, this is all the other things that I'm doing. I think we need to kind of take this off the table." And I agreed because I've seen all the other stuff that you have been doing.
Right. And so, but all that to say, I think that when it's the topic of consent, it's really, really important for the husband, the dominant partner, to be open to those conversations and to create an environment where the submissive wife feels comfortable coming to him with those conversations and that he listens to her and validates her concerns. And that even if he, because let's say I came to you and I set out a limit that was like, hey, I'm not really comfortable with this, but it was really kind of a non-negotiable. Then we would have to have a conversation. I would want my feelings to be validated, even if you're like, hey, let's find a compromise there because not doing it is not an option.
Right, right. And we've had conversations like that before on some things. Again, I don't nothing in particular is coming to mind, but I do recall where we have had to where we've talked about that, like we've wanted to drop something and said, no, I don't think that would be good, but let's renegotiate terms, if you will, on something.
Right, because I think when we first started a bedtime, you had this idea that I would be able to go to bed at like 11 p.m.
Because I underestimated how much of a night owl you are.
And to a certain extent, there were many nights where you were not going to bed until after 11.
No, because I was either working late or whatever.
And not that you couldn't send me to bed first, but that's just not typically how we work.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Well, no, again, because you tend to be more of a night owl. I'm what they call an afternoonie. I didn't even know. I thought you either had to be a night owl or a morning person, but I'm an afternoonie. So I get a lot of energy right after lunch, where a lot of people are tanking. I get inspiration and energy, and so I don't have a ton of energy in the morning, and I don't have a ton at night. And so I just assumed you were like me. Well, you just try to get in bed at the right time, and you just go to sleep. Maybe you need to take a little melatonin, and that's the way that works. And so, this is another good thing to bring up when you're making these rules and you're talking about consent. I specifically want to talk to the guys. You need to realize that your wife is not like you, and she has different strengths and weaknesses than you, and she has different obstacles than you have, and so you need to be sensitive to that to the extent that when you and I were talking, for instance, that when you asked me to hold you accountable to certain things, that I some of those were not obstacles for me, but they were for you, and so you really needed me to follow through with those things. But also some guys could look at what their I didn't do this, but some guys I'm sure could look at what their wives are asking them to hold accountable for and go, really, you really have an issue with that? Well, be sensitive to that, because yeah, maybe she does. You don't, but maybe she does.
Well, and it's all about looking at the individual and realizing that everyone has their individual needs and setting goals, setting rules, and enforcing punishments to the goal of creating an atmosphere where your wife can grow and can be the best version of herself. And just where she has the ability to, you don't want to let bad habits go on just because, well, that's just who she is. No, I mean, yes, I'm a night owl, but that doesn't mean that you're allowing me to stay up till all hours of the
Well,
night.
and just so that people know, you're much of a night owl that, and I'm not trying to beat you over the head with this, but if I let you stay up till 3, you probably would.
Oh, absolutely.
Because you're very, it's not that you just refuse to go to bed, you're very productive. Like you get a lot of energy and you could do stuff.
Oh, absolutely. And that was happening before we instituted a bedtime. That's one reason we decided to tackle that as one of our very first things.
And I remember it was because like if you had nothing to do the next day, it wouldn't have been a big deal. But the fact that you needed to get up and homeschool our daughter and some of the other things that we do, it made it difficult for you because you were only getting maybe 3 or 4 hours of sleep sometimes.
Right, and that was obviously affecting so many other areas of my life as well. And the fact that we don't live in a big home. And so, the upkeep of the home was starting to suffer because if everyone else is asleep, I can't do dishes and vacuum and mop and do all the
Right.
things because we're all on one level and there's not very much space between the areas. And so it's just one of those things where it made a whole lot of sense for me to adjust my sleep schedule, but it didn't make it easy. And that was a discussion that needed to be had. I feel like we're getting way off topic. We're talking a whole lot about my sleep schedule.
No, but I think this is important because this is exactly what we're talking about. You first had to give me consent to hold you accountable to a sleep schedule. We agreed on implementing what that punishment would be. That was something that we agreed upon together. It wasn't something that I just said, well, this is the punishment, and you're going to do that. You consented to that, and you gave me consent to hold you accountable to it. And so we started, just so they know, you need to start with realistic goals and consent to those, because we slowly have tailored back we started kind of broad where I was like, okay, you've been going to bed at 3, try 2. And you started getting in bed at 2. Right. Well, no, that's what I mean. Like you have to be in bed by 2. And now we're slowly getting, because we eventually said we want to get you to the point where you don't necessarily have to go to bed as early as me, because you get up a little later than I do, because I do tend to get up a little early because I have to. And so, but we're trying to get it to a point where you're still getting a good, adequate amount of sleep, but you can still stay up a little past so you can have some time to yourself and everything. And so, no, I think that was important that we went into a few of the details so they realize these were things that you consented on and we negotiated.
Well, and even if it had been your idea, even if you would have come to me and said, hey, this is an area that you need to improve. This is not healthy for your overall health. It's not healthy for your function during the day. It's counterproductive to the rest of the goals that you have. So we need to tackle this. So what I'm saying is that as a husband, it's okay for you to bring areas of concern to your wife, areas that you feel she needs to improve, but it's really important for a wife to feel empowered to be a part of that conversation in order to give her consent. So when the topic of bedtime came up, obviously I was already on board because I was feeling the negative effects of not getting enough sleep.
Right.
But if that would have been something that was completely your idea, then I would have probably said, okay, I understand that that's an area of concern, but can we discuss and negotiate the particulars of how we want to handle that?
Yeah.
because I would not have been able to go from staying up till 3 or later sometimes to all of a sudden you need to start your bedtime routine at 9 o'clock and be in bed by 10. That would not have worked for me, and that's not a transition that I could have consented to at the time.
That's kind of like what I said last week about going from 0 to 60 really fast. That'd have been going from like 90 miles an hour down to 0. That can cause a crash real quick.
And so, we had to discuss and we had to consent to the particulars of that. And I needed to consent to the punishments
Yes,
that
that's true
were
too.
going to be put in place.
Yeah. Yeah, and that was something that we had discussed too. That I think is good to bring up about when it came to the sleep things. We negotiated punishment too. It wasn't like I just got to make that up. I mean, you let me come to the table with some ideas, but we agreed on. There was consent on what we were going to do.
Anytime we add or take away or change any of the particular rules, we always have a negotiation period and a discussion period where we say, this is what's working, this is what's not working, this is what needs to be added. And we always discuss potential punishments for those rules.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, this year we implemented a tier system, and that I feel like that's been working well.
It has helped me a lot. I'm glad. That's all I'm going to say. From my position to have a tier system so that I don't have, because for a while I just think I was kind of putting my fingers in the air and seeing where the wind was blowing and making stuff up off the fly, and I don't think some of this is too much to go into for now, but I think I was picking punishments that didn't fit the crime.
Right, and you were picking punishments that had been negotiated and agreed upon, so it wasn't like a lack of consent, it was just a lack of structure.
Right, exactly.
And we're going to have a whole topic on punishments.
I was going to say, I don't want to go into that right now because I know we're going to have a podcast about that.
Right. But the biggest takeaway here is that there has to be a discussion and there has to be a understanding that even as a wife, you can say, I don't consent to that.
Yes.
And it's not undermining your husband's authority.
No.
And it's not stepping outside the bounds of your position in the relationship to say, I don't consent to.
In fact, I would say also that the only way it undermines my authority is if, like, you're rude about it. But you never have been. I mean, that's what I want people to understand is, like, that's not undermining. Negotiating things like this is not undermining your authority. And so unless there's disrespect happening, it's not undermining authority.
Right, and we have rules around respect.
We do, yeah.
And so even if I was disrespectful about it, then you could hold me accountable for my disrespectful behavior.
Yes, I could. Right.
And so I've learned to be able to communicate respectfully. And part of that is I know that you're going to listen to me and you're going to validate my feelings and you're not going to brush me off. So I don't need to act out in order to get the attention that I need at that moment.
And this is something that maybe I should mention in future podcasts, but I'm just going to mention a little bit here because this maybe is a whole nother topic. But this just brings up that, yes, all of those things I try to do. And so, gentlemen, if you want consent and respect from your wife, you need to be a person that is willing to allow her to have consent and allow her to know that you are not going to be a dictator. Because if you're just in this for power and you're in this to make yourself look big, it's not going to work. I don't know if that was too much to go into, but
No, and I think that we could do a whole episode on leadership as well, because that is a topic that could take its own time. But I think that part of the reason why you need to have consent is speaking from the perspective of a couple that lives in the United States, we live in a society that highly favors women as far as when legalities get involved.
Yeah, that's true.
And so there has to be a level of consent, because if you don't, then there's a high probability that things could go very wrong for you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And also, I think that as a leader, you need to lead from a place of understanding, and you need to lead from a place of control. And one way that you practice control is by functioning within the boundaries of my consent.
Yes. Yeah, and that's why I think, and great job bringing that full circle. Um, I think that's why, again, consent is so important. Because this just really, if you don't have this first, it's all going to fall apart. This really is the foundation of everything that we're talking about.
Right. And now there have been times where maybe I've stepped outside the bounds of a negotiated rule. You've had to come in and tell me that I'm out of line and that I'm going to be punished, and I don't agree with that. Does that mean that you are violating my consent by upholding the punishment?
No, because we've already pre-negotiated those.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, but I would say that it's important for you, speaking to you as my husband, but also you as the general audience of men, in those moments, it's important for you to take the time to point out and to get me to recognize and accept where I fell short
Right.
and agree that punishment is appropriate. Because, at least for me, punishment is not productive if I go into it thinking I don't deserve this.
Right.
And so, but it's not a violation of consent. And I think that most women within a domestic discipline relationship would say punishment is never something that they would choose to go through. It's not something that they want to have to endure or go through at the moment. But it's not a violation of consent because they consented to the relationship structure and they consented to the punishment being an option.
Yes. Right. Yeah. Well said. Well said on that. And I think I don't even really have too much to add there, because I think you hit the nail right on the head. And again, this is, I always talk about the foundation, even though I'm not very handy with my hands. When it comes to being, I'm not a handyman, but I always talk about the most important thing in a house, building a house, is the foundation. And so that's why, if you want this domestic discipline relationship to work, you have got to lay a very good foundation. And that foundation has to be that foundation of consent. Otherwise, that's not going to work. And so we wanted to talk a little bit about, before we ended the podcast, and we've still got time to talk about boundaries, right?
Mm-hmm. And what our own boundaries are.
Do you want to start? Or you want me?
Why don't you start? Because I don't think that I even know the entirety of your boundaries within our relationship.
Well, yeah, because we've never. Okay, you all are getting. I'm just letting you all know. You guys are kind of getting a first right now, because yeah, we've never really talked about this too much. And well, my boundaries is and I don't mind sharing this with you all. I have suffered, and my wife knows this, that especially as a child, I suffered with a lot of anger issues. Now, to be fair, you would never say that you thought my anger issues were ever bad to the point where you thought I was going to be physically
Oh,
harmful
never.
to you.
Never.
So I just want to establish that right now to everybody. Like, I'm not one of these crazy guys, and I very much frown on physical abuse of women. But I had some anger problems, and so my boundaries very much. I think a lot about how close is this going to push me to my limit of anger. With different things.
So your boundary is that you would never punish me if you were feeling angry.
Yes, thank you. This is what my wife is really good at. Is I say something and she's good at helping interpret to others. So even though I speak English, she has to still interpret it for others. But that's exactly right. Is I never want to punish in anger. And there have been some times, remember, where I've had to say, hey, we're going to have to take a time out till I get my anger under control before we go forward in whatever it is that we're doing, because I never want to do something in anger, because I don't trust myself in being able to give you the effective punishment and perhaps go too far. And I never want to do that. And so I am constantly thinking about that. I am constantly thinking about how is this affecting me in the department of anger. And start maybe we can interject here a little bit, because as you start talking about your boundaries, I might go, as it is on a lot of podcasts, as soon as we start talking about it, I can't remember anything but one. But
Sure. So one of my boundaries is that I have, when we were talking about like punishments, for instance, one of my big boundaries with spanking specifically is that I do not want to have broken skin. Like, that is a
yes,
limit that I have, where I don't mind you spanking me. I don't mind you spanking me quite hard if that's what's needed at the time. But I do not want to be dealing with wound care.
I think that's a boundary we share, because I don't want to do that either.
Yeah.
Because it bothers me when if that were to happen. Because again, as I mentioned just before, I am against physical violence against women, and I don't want to ever be perceived as someone who's violent or
And
anything like that.
in fact, this is a boundary that of yours that I feel like shifted and changed over time. You used to have a boundary even against bruising me.
Yeah, until I found out you bruise kind of easily. Sorry.
I do. And you also found that spankings that did not produce some amount of bruising were quite ineffective.
Yes.
For
Yeah.
me.
For you, right? Because you have a high pain tolerance, and also, it's just who you are.
Mm-hmm.
And so I needed to. It would. Now I want everybody to know, like, I'm not going for a bruise. I'm just going for an effective punishment or an effective reset. And I just know that usually that means you're going to wind up bruising.
And
But I'm not, going
Sure.
for it in on purpose until.
No, bruising and marks are never the goal.
No.
But one thing that is definitely a goal is to not break skin.
Right. Exactly.
And since you used our little code word that we use, reset is synonymous with maintenance.
All right. Sorry. Yeah. Maintenance. Sorry. That's our code word. I'm just so used to saying it. So, yeah. So, yeah, definitely that's definitely a boundary with me, for sure.
Another boundary that I have is I do not accept any type of physical correction on anywhere other than my bottom and like my upper thighs.
Right.
So you're not allowed to spank or hit or strike any other part of my body.
That's why. See, this is why I'm glad you started going with your boundaries, because I'm nodding my head, going, yes, okay, yeah, that's a boundary of mine too. That was something that we shared. Because again, I did not want anybody to perceive that I was a mean person or an evil person towards you.
Right.
If they ever found out about this dynamic in our relationship.
One of my and most of my limits are around punishments, because that's the part that affects me the most directly. I don't consent to, and I don't think we've ever even discussed this, because I don't think that it's something that you would do, but I don't consent to you withholding meals as a form of
Oh
punishment.
yeah, that you're right. No, we've talked about that just maybe once,
Now,
but
treats and sweets and special things are different. I'm talking about withholding actual like
but
meals.
even that, I just want to talk about just real quick, just camp on treats and everything. Another thing that we negotiated, another thing that was consented upon, right?
Right.
Like that wasn't something that I was just kind of allowed. Like again, that was something we talked about. But yeah, no, not withholding. That's just that's just being cruel at that point because people need to eat. They need nourishment. That's just not right to do that kind of thing.
Um,
I think another boundary that I have is that you know like I'm not I've heard of this. Tell me if you have heard of this, but just in my own articles that I've read of even some of them withholding like bathroom privileges. I mean, that's I don't want to call them privileges, but allowing them not to use
access.
access to the bathroom. I mean, that's something that I'm like, no, I will not do that. That's wrong.
I have heard of that, but honestly, the places where I've heard of that are more geared towards like fetish.
But that's different, obviously,
That
than
that's
what we're
different,
talking
and
about.
there is, there's still quite a high risk profile with doing that in any regard, but definitely that's not something I would consent to.
Right, right, and that's a hard boundary because again, that's just something that to me is a basic human right. You need to be allowed to have that. So I don't know. And maybe people are going, okay, you guys are saying things that are very very obvious, but this is what can happen if you don't talk about boundaries. These things may seem obvious, but you need to talk about them. Is what I'm
Right.
trying to say.
And sometimes you don't talk about them until they come up. You
That's true.
know,
Yeah.
we talked about I don't consent to mouth soaping. And we already kind of covered that, but I also would not consent to you withholding my access to communicate to the outside world.
Oh yeah. Right.
Meaning
Right.
that if, as a punishment, you said you're not allowed to use your phone for any other purpose than to make necessary phone calls, that would be fine. But if you were to physically take my phone to work with you as a punishment, that's not something I would consent to because if an emergency happened,
Right.
I need to be able to do what I need to do to access communication.
Yeah. And that's something that I would not do because that's exactly right. You never know. We need that in case of emergencies. And I mean, you've done so good now on Instagram too. I mean, that would just be a death sentence to the Instagram account. So I'm being facetious.
Yes, you are,
But
because
but no, that's absolutely right. Is no, I don't think that that's the right thing to do. And again, every relationship is different. But I don't know. I would if I ever heard that a guy did that in his domestic discipline relationship. I mean, I don't know.
if we had a home phone, that would be different.
Wait, what's a home phone? No.
Right?
Some of the people listening may not even remember. There was a time.
I was about to say the last time we had what they used to call landline or a home phone
Yeah.
was about 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And
Been a while.
so, or a little over 10 years. And so, but if we had that, then that would be completely different. But since my cell phone is the only access to emergency communication that I have, I would not consent to you completely taking that away. Now, I would consent to you saying you're not allowed to be on your phone unless it is to for emergency purposes or to call me.
Right. Right.
But if you're like you're not allowed to just call your friends and chat, you're not allowed to just access your entertainment apps, social media, whatever. That's something that I would consent to as long as I maintained access to
Right.
make phone calls.
Right. So I guess what we're trying to say is I at least I see is all of our boundaries I feel like are very humane, realistic boundaries.
Right, and every couple and every person needs to decide where those boundaries lie with them and within their relationship and what makes sense to them.
Yes, and as we talked about, that's going to look different with every couple.
And I'm home all day, and so my boundaries reflect that. If your wife is working, then you will have boundaries around the extent of, you know, how your dynamic affects her workplace
Yeah.
environment.
Yeah.
Because it really, no one outside of your dynamic should really know what's going on,
Yes.
because that's private.
Right. Right. Exactly.
And you need to
Exactly.
put boundaries in place to keep those things private.
That's true. That's true. So I know we could keep going and going and going on all this, but I know we've specifically said we don't want to make these podcasts too long. So do we want to kind of shut this down
Oh,
for this
absolutely.
episode?
And I think we've come full circle, and I think we've really wrapped it up
Didn't chase
pretty
too
well.
many rabbits. Um, do
A
you
few.
do you want to kind of tell them where all of our accounts and everything? I know she manages all of that because she's better at managing all that. So you want to tell everybody where to find you and find this and everything?
For sure. So if you're listening to us on YouTube right now, we have a Patreon where you can get early access to our podcast episodes. Our podcast episodes come out on Patreon 2 weeks before they hit YouTube. Or you can follow us on Instagram at _disciplined life. My personal Instagram is in period my period proper period place. And that just has more domestic discipline content. I hold Q&As on that account. And everything.
You and Caleb have a podcast if they want to check that out.
Yes. So on my Instagram account, the In My Proper Place, I have a link in my bio that you can join the traditional domestic discipline Substack, or the traditional domestic discipline locals group. Both are ran by an account called his account is DD Believers, and his name is Caleb, and I host a podcast with him on the Substack group. So just a lot going on, a whole lot of content from me and from us and from Caleb that you guys can get connected in with. I will have all of those links down in a link tree in the description box, and I hope to see you guys on the next episode.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say, is there a place real quick where they could give us, feedback on whether they are liking the content?
So the best way to give us direct feedback is through Instagram DMs right now.
Oh, yes. Okay.
If you're listening on YouTube, go ahead and leave a comment. Otherwise,
okay,
that's the best way to do it.
Okay, great. Well, we will then, I guess I would not see, but you guys will hear us later in the next episode. Thank you for tuning in to the podcast, either this afternoon, evening, or morning, whenever you're listening to this.